All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming over. It's, just when you kind of get, used to the warmer weather, which I guess in the 50s is warm for us. This dampness is it's too cold. But anyway, so glad you guys could all venture out. So, welcome to our monthly LEPC meeting. Today we have a special presentation, which has been something that a lot of the stakeholders in town have been working towards with our friends from the Woods Hole Group, and we'll get into that in a second. But just for our housekeeping, right over here on the table as you make your entrance into the training room here, we have a sign-up sheet. If your name's not there, certainly there's a space you can put your name, and you can also add your email address should you want to be added to our notification list for anything that Kim might be sending out, and obviously notifications on topics and our agenda for each of our LEPC meetings. So again, today we have a presentation from the Woods Hole Group. They've been working on the town's hazard mitigation plan. We've been meeting for, I don't know how many months, but yeah, so it's been, it at first was, had started with Melissa Jaffe, who was with Woods Hole Group, and she has since moved on. So now we have Leslie Fields is now taken over, and she jumped right into the thick of things, and Callie Roberts, so she's also helping. Leslie we've seen in the past, so it's good that we have familiar faces. But part of our discussions with this hazard mitigation planning has been a group of a lot of the stakeholders in town with the different departments. And part of what we're trying to do is to identify, our critical infrastructure that could be affected during storms, especially as it's related to some of the significant damage that could occur, especially in the flooding, parts of town that can, greatly, affect, town trying to get back some of their infrastructure. And so, luckily, we've been working also with the DPW, and they've been very helpful. Kim, as part of, her responsibilities with, our emergency management side, we do our tier 2 identifications. We know where a lot of our hazards are, and we can kind of coordinate a lot of our information back and forth with the Woods Hole Group. And when they're all done with this plan, it also helps us with, any grants that might be available through FEMA, because this work's been done. So I think in the past, Falmouth is very fortunate that we have the experts out there to help, guide us in some of these areas, and and we certainly have utilized FEMA during some of our storms. There's always a threshold of a damage that has to occur, whether it's on a local level or on a county level. But FEMA is, I'm sure Peter could go on and on about it, but it's a very thorough process, and sometimes all the work you put into it goes on for how many years, Peter?
2012.
Yep, so we still, but fortunately everybody coordinates their activity. Kim does an awful lot of work with the DPW. Peter's been pulled into that rabbit hole as well. But in the end, if we can get any type of funding back, if we have grant availability, it certainly will help us to either prepare or to recoup any of the funds that were lost to make these repairs. So, so for me, it's been an eye-opener, because hadn't been involved in any of these hazard mitigation planning sessions before, and listening to it, and it's very, very extensive, very thorough. But as each one rolled out, it got a little better, because I understood a little more, and with how we were trying to identify things, a little more explanation, learned a little bit about a lot of the terminology that's being used, and I think that all the work that's being put into it by all the other town departments is a big benefit for us moving forward. So that being said, Leslie and Callie, I'll leave it up to you guys.
All right,
so
thank you. I guess I'll just
Yeah.
stand. Yeah.
Yeah. You do what you
All right.
like.
Okay, so I'm here to talk about the Falmouth Multihazard Mitigation Plan. It's a public presentation that I'm giving. We're about half to 3/4 of the way in preparing the plan. And we're here to, this works, I tried it.
Okay.
Yeah. We're here to just update the public on, why you need one of these multi-hazard mitigation plans, how the work we've done and where we're going and when we're going to be finished. My name is Leslie Fields, and I'm a Coastal Sciences Woodsole Group. As the chief said, Melissa was working on this project earlier, but has moved on to become a physician's assistant, so completely different from coastal sciences. So, and then I also have Kelly Roberts helping me here too as well. So we'll be able to answer any questions that you guys have at the end of the presentation. A couple of ground rules. I think this slide was more geared towards the time when we were doing remote meetings, but just if you can turn off your phones, and if you have questions, let's try to hold them till the end, and we'll address those questions at the end. I also understand that the meeting is being recorded and will be posted on
FCTV.
Okay, FCTV. So if there's other people who want to look at it later, or if any of you want to go back and look at it later, you certainly have that ability. So this is an outline or an overview of the presentation. So I'm going to give you a little overview of what a multi-hazard mitigation plan process involves, so why the town, should have one, and we'll also talk about an overview of the chapters that are in the multi-hazard mitigation plan. We're going to focus on chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 is the hazard identification chapter, and 4 is the vulnerability assessment. We're almost nearly done with both of those chapters, so that's why I'm going to focus on those. The next public presentation that will be in July will focus more on the subsequent chapters. I'll touch a little bit on the public participation, what are the avenues that the public has to participate in this process, and then I'll also go into the schedule that we have for finishing it. So just an overview of the hazard mitigation planning process. So, what is a multi-hazard mitigation plan? It's basically a plan that helps the community minimize loss of life and loss of property damage as a result of natural hazards. And those natural hazards can be anything from, flooding, hurricanes, wind damage, tornadoes, which we don't have much of here, but any sort of natural hazard. It's not things like hazards from, say, a pandemic or anything like that. So it's all natural hazards. And basically it's helping the town identify ways to reduce risks from those natural hazards. So after we identify what all the hazards are and identify the vulnerabilities, then we'll come up with recommendations for the town to take in a way to minimize risks from these hazards. And the goal is ultimately to sort of help the town save money by sort of instigating some of these mitigation measures. So, for example, if you've got some facilities that are particularly vulnerable that we'll identify, we can make recommendations for reducing vulnerability. And if you carry that out, then next time we have a storm, we're going to save money because you're not going to have the damages to that infrastructure. And then also, as Chief said, the plan makes the town eligible for funding from FEMA. And 3 of the main programs FEMA has for municipalities are listed here. There's the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grants, or BRIC grants, sort of a new program. I think it's the second year of that program. And that's pre-disaster mitigation funding. So before you've got the disaster, if you identify your vulnerabilities, these are the programs that, this is the program that you can use to get money to address those issues. There's also the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. So this is something that the towns can apply for to FEMA, but it's really something that private homeowners and property owners can apply to the town to get some of this money if the town is awarded it. So it's like elevating structures, elevating their homes, things like that. So that can be available for private property owners, private homeowners. And then the third thing is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and this is really money that is made available after there's a disaster declaration. So we've got some sort of a major winter storm or something like Hurricane Bob, and then Barnstable County or Falmouth is declared a disaster area, then FEMA makes monies available to the communities, and then the communities can use that money to implement a project which will reduce vulnerability and build resiliency in the future. So those are the three main programs. It's really important that the town keeps this plan up to date and current. You need to update it every 5 years. It's just important to keep it updated so that you'll be available to receive these monies from FEMA. Okay, as far as the overall multi-hazard mitigation planning process, what goes into this process? How do we put together a multi-hazard mitigation plan? There's a number of really key steps. The first one is to identify and describe the hazards. So again, that's things like winter storms, thunderstorms, flooding events, hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that, and identify how those particular hazards can impact your community. And I'm going to go through all the hazards that we have here in Falmouth in a second in more detail. Another step is to identify the community assets and critical facilities. And this is something that we've been working with very closely with the local planning team in identifying what these facilities are in town. And so those are things like, your hospitals, your town facilities, your wastewater facilities, water facilities, hospitals, if I didn't mention that, daycare centers potentially, senior facilities, things like that, that are either important because they have vulnerable populations in them and we need to watch out for them during storms, or because these facilities provide critical services during or after a storm. So those are why we want to identify those critical facilities. The next step is to conduct the vulnerability assessment. So once we figure out what the critical facilities are, the next step is to identify what are those facilities vulnerable to. Is it flooding? Is it winds? Which natural hazards are these facilities most at risk for? And then that helps us identify the fourth thing, which is the mitigation actions. As far as the chapters that are in the multi-hazard mitigation plan, chapters 1 and 2 we've already completed. Those are basically the introduction and local profiles, so that's really sort of historical information. Chapter 3, as I said, is the identification of those hazards and where those hazards occur within town. So whether it's town-wide or is it just along the coast or in areas that are more vulnerable to, flooding from rainfall, things like that. The fourth chapter is the vulnerability assessment that I've talked about. Chapters 3 and 4 are really the meatiest. That's sort of the biggest chapters in the hazard mitigation plan. Again, those are the ones I'm going to go through in detail today. Chapter 5 is the mitigation measures, as I said, and 6 is sort of the planning maintenance process. And what I mean by that is it outlines all the things and steps that the town needs to take in order to keep your plan up to date and to document over the next 5 years how you're checking off these various recommendations that have been provided in the plan. What are you implementing? What are you doing in order to reduce vulnerability? So it's just tracking the progress in performing those mitigation actions. Okay, here again, just the overview of the multi-hazard mitigation chapters. I'm going to talk about chapter 3 and chapter 4. So in chapter 3, again, we talk about all the hazards. And we've got 15 hazards here in the plan that we're going to address. You might look at this list and say, well, some of those don't really affect us, like tsunamis, landslides. It seems kind of crazy that they're in here, but FEMA requires that each town include all the hazards that are in the state hazard mitigation plan. So because tsunamis and landslides are in that state hazard mitigation plan, we've got to have an Falmouth plan. So that's why those are there. In working with the local planning team, they also identified 2 other hazards that they wanted to include in the plan, which is something that FEMA certainly encourages and allows, and that's this dam and culvert failure and freshwater quality. The dam and culvert failure, we don't really have many dams in Falmouth. There are a number of culverts, however, and those can become important if they're beginning to fail, if there's some sort of heavy rainfall event, for example, and the culverts failed and we're trying to, let water out of a pond. There's, lots of, the elevation of the water in the pond is really high and we can't release that water, then that's a hazard that we want to try to address and mitigate. Culverts are also important in terms of sort of ecological restoration of more inland areas that have been affected by sort of restricted tidal flow over time. So that's another thing that we would like to look at as a part of adding that to the plan. The freshwater quality was another thing that the committee wanted to add, and that has to do with trying to identify areas where we've got increases in cyanobacteria and trying to identify ways that we might address that in the future moving forward. So those two areas were added. And we'll try to identify recommendations for mitigating those hazards, impacts from those hazards. All right, so I'm going to go through each one of these just kind of briefly so you can get an idea of the extent of those hazards in town and the data that we use in order to develop these maps. So the first one here is flooding. We combined coastal and inland flooding on this slide here. The data source we're using is the FEMA effective map. We're looking at the July 2021 effective FEMA map. I think town-wide, those maps were most recently updated in 2016. But every time there's like a LOMR or a LOMR that FEMA approves, they'll give it a new date. So the data we use is the most up-to-date, most recent data that we have from FEMA that shows flooding during that 100-year storm event or the 1% storm event. And that's present-day flooding. Basically what you can see from here is, no surprise, but most of that flooding is really along the coast. Let's see a fair, is there a pointer in here? Maybe I probably can't do it here.
Yeah.
Most of the flooding, we see a lot of flooding along those finger ponds in East Falmouth, sort of up along the edges of those ponds and at the upper ends of them, northern ends of them, and also in the area of Chappaquiddick Beach and West Falmouth Harbor, and then also up in the North Falmouth area and Wild Harbor and a few of the other harbors that up in that area. Okay, sort of looking into the future in terms of flooding that might occur. We used a couple of sources. We looked at some NOAA tide gauge data from Woods Hole, and that's this upper graph on the left. And so those data, goes from about 1920 to the present. And it shows that we've got almost a foot of sea level rise over the last 80 years in Woods Hole. So sea level's rising, we all know that, or hopefully we all know that. And the way that it's going to affect us, and this little figure on the lower left is meant to sort of illustrate that. The dark blue area is the elevation of mean high water right now against the shoreline. And then the lighter blue area is sort of the effect of storm surge. So when we have a storm and waves, it's going to reach further inland. And so you can just see progressively in 2010, 2050, and 2100 in that graph on the left, you can just see that with the sea level rise, that storm surge is reaching further and further inland and impacting more and more of the developed properties. So that's why we want to look at this, future flooding scenarios. One of the data sets, or the data set that we use to assess future flooding in Falmouth is one that Woods Hole Group developed. We're really proud of it. It's something we developed for the Mass Department of Transportation for the entire state. And so we're looking at the potential for flooding in 2030, 2050, and 2070, and providing probabilities of flooding during those scenarios. And so this graph, or the image on the right, shows the probability of flooding in 2030. And then I've got two more slides, one in 2050 and one in 2070. And because of the scale of because Falmouth is so big, it's a little bit hard for you to see, but I'm hoping you can sort of see the differences in the flooding as I go through the two other pictures. And again, look at sort of these areas at the northern end of the ponds in East Falmouth and up in North Falmouth and around West Falmouth Harbor. Let's see, as far as the colors go, so the colors that are dark blue are ones that have a higher probability of flooding. And then as you move to sort of greens, those are sort of big storms that you might have. And then sort of the yellows and the oranges and the reds are moving up towards what, sort of towards that 100-year event. So something sort of analogous to FEMA's flood maps. All right, so this is 2050. You can see a little bit more flooding there in East Falmouth at the head of, I guess, Green and Great Pond, and also Bourne's Pond. And then here's 2070. So it just extends further, and the probability of flooding in those areas, say around West Falmouth Harbor and Wild Harbor and up in North Falmouth, that increases. So it's just the probability of flooding is definitely increasing. So we've used this data set to help assess vulnerability of resources in the town of Falmouth. This next one is coastal erosion. The data set we used here was the Massachusetts Coastal Zone Management Shoreline Change Project. And that data set provides two different time periods that they look at. One is a long-term shoreline change from the 1800s to present, or I think it's to early 2013 or 14. And then there's the shorter time period, which is 1970s to 2013 or 14. So the left graph is a longer term, the right image is a shorter term. The areas that are shown in red are areas that have higher rates of erosion, and we don't really see too many areas of accretion in Falmouth, unfortunately. But over the long term, we see a significant erosion, again, over East Falmouth, so in the areas of Green Pond, Great Pond, Bourne's Pond, and also over under Washburn Island, and there's some up in Chapel Point as well. If you move to the shorter term, so from the 1970s to the present, the biggest areas are really right around Minot Beach, which we all know has had a big problem with erosion. So this is another data set that we're using to assess hazards in the town of Falmouth. Hurricanes and tropical storms. One of the data sets we used here, or the data set we used here, was an Army Corps of Engineers model. It's called the SLOSH model, and that stands for Sea, Lake, and Overland Surge from Hurricanes. And what that model does is it shows what areas of town are inundated with different category storms. So there's category 1 storm, category 2, 3, and 4. So it shows the areas that are inundated with these progressively stronger and stronger storms. Here again, no surprise, we're seeing most of the impacts along the coast, along those coastal ponds in East Falmouth, up around West Falmouth Harbor, and then a lot up in North Falmouth as well, some in Woods Hole as well. So we'll be using this to help assess impacts from hurricanes and tropical storms and helping to develop resiliency measures based on that. Severe winter weather is another one. So this is mainly snowfall, I guess. So we don't get not as much snowfall as they do in northern New England or Maine and Vermont and such, but we can regularly get snowfall, as you all know, on the south coast here. The data shows an average annual snowfall from the Northeast Regional Climate Center. That's the data set we're using. And it shows on average we get between 20 and 40 inches of snowfall a year. I feel like we probably got less than that this year, but I'm not quite sure. Sort of depends on how that snowfall occurs in order for us to determine, what the risks are. If it comes in small increments over the years, it's not really such a big deal. But if it comes, in 2 feet at a time, then that's, more of a problem and it's harder to deal with. The right graph here shows the number of disaster declarations as a result of snowfall between 1953 and 2017. So it shows that Barnstable had 8 disaster declarations as a result of this natural hazard over that time period, which was kind of higher than I thought it would be, but it just, you know, points out that we really do need to include this as a hazard and try to plan for it. Wildfire. Here we used town data to identify numbers of wildfires, and we were looking at the period from 2018 to 2021. On average, I think we've got between 7 and 27 wildfires over this period in any given year. Tend to be kind of small fires that the department is able to get to quickly and put out quick, so it's not a tremendous risk, but it's still, you know, something that we want to track and be ready to respond to make sure it doesn't get to be a bigger problem. Next one is tornadoes. We don't normally think of Massachusetts as being in an area that's got a lot of tornadoes, but it's still something we wanted to track. There have been a number of tornadoes that are scattered throughout the state over the years. Where these data come from NOAA's National Weather Service Center. They tend to be fairly small and of a low sort of category and not very long-lived. So a couple of these you can see, there's only a few that have those long lines where the tornado really strung out over a long period of time and traveled a great distance, but those are kind of few and far between. We don't have any tornadoes that have been recorded in Falmouth itself. So that's a good thing. Drought, the next one. So that's another natural hazard that we included was drought. This is a map from DCR's drought status report. It shows the data through August of 2021. It shows that Falmouth at that time was in a level 1, sort of a mild drought condition. The table on the right shows the history of the drought status from 2016 to 2021. So you can see that in 2020, around July, between July and June and July, we went from mild to a significant drought classification. And I think just moving forward with, you know, climate change and increased heat and whatnot, that this drought hazard is going to become more prevalent and a bigger problem. So here again, it's a good thing you're including it in the plan, and we need to, you know, plan for it and make recommendations on how to mitigate the impacts of that. Next one is extreme temperature. So on the left, you've got, this sort of goes both ways. You've got heat and you've got cold temperatures. On the left, you've got the extreme heat. When you start thinking about combining high temperatures with high humidity, you get this higher heat index, where it really feels and seems a lot hotter than it is, and it can have health impacts on vulnerable populations. So it's something that we want to track and try to mitigate. Similarly, on the right, we've got cold temperatures. So when you combine the cold temperatures with wind, increased winds, you've got an increase for wind chill factors, and that can increase probabilities of frostbite and also impact sort of operations of mechanical equipment that you know has trouble operating in low temperatures. As I said, both of these can affect sort of public health and safety, so it's something we want to manage. Earthquakes, not particularly something that we worry too much about in Falmouth, but it's still something we want to include. The data comes from the USGS Earthquake Data Center that shows that we've experienced, I guess, one earthquake. I don't know what time period this is over, but since 1970. It had a magnitude of 2 to 3. So even though it was sort of a relatively low magnitude, this table here on the right shows that if you've got an earthquake that's between magnitude 2 and 3, it's something that either maybe you're not going to feel or you're going to feel it sort of mildly, and it's going to have just minor damage. So while bigger earthquakes are certainly possible, it's not that common here in Falmouth. And then this last one here just shows some of the other other hazards we're looking at. So we've got heavy precipitation, high wind, and thunder and lightning. So it's possible that we're going to be getting sort of more rainfall with climate change in the future, so it's something we want to try to manage. We can see here on the right, the NOAA National Thunderstorm Database shows that we get about 20 thunderstorms a year that have impact on Falmouth. That middle graph there is for high winds. So this is data from the state, EOEEA. We went out and measured winds everywhere. No surprise, we have higher winds along the coast than we do inland, and so we need to try to manage those impacts. Now, I also mentioned that the town added dams and culverts and freshwater quality as hazards to the plan. We're still in the process of developing and compiling information on those hazards. I don't have slides for them, unfortunately, to show you today, but they'll be included in the final plan and certainly available for public comment when we put them in the plan. All right, next thing we did was we wanted to rank these hazards. So now we're done talking about the hazards, now we wanted to rank them. We're still in the process of working through this with the local planning committee, but I wanted to go ahead and show you what we have so far. So on the left of this table here are all the hazards that we just talked about. And what we did was we looked at them in terms of their likelihood to occur. So is it very unlikely, or is it very, highly likely it's going to occur? Severity, and that can go from minor up to catastrophic. And then area, is it just going to occur in a small localized area like coastal flooding that doesn't affect the whole town, or is it going to have the potential to affect, Falmouth town-wide? So for example, if you had something like severe winter weather that is highly likely to occur, and it has the potential to cause serious impacts, and it's going to occur town-wide, that's going to get a higher ranking. So that came up with a ranking of 12. If you compare it with something like tsunamis that are very unlikely here, and that have minor severity and are sort of isolated, then that's going to come up with a lower ranking. So it just helps us, a table like this really helps us to target the mitigation actions to the hazards that are, that have the highest ranking. All right, moving on to chapter 4. This is the vulnerability assessment. So we looked at vulnerability in 3 ways, and they're listed here on the left. So the first one is, what is the vulnerability from flooding to the critical facilities? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about critical facilities in a second, but that was one thing we looked at. Then we also looked at flooding vulnerability to town-wide by looking at each of the parcels in town and quantifying what the effects of flooding are on each of those parcels, whether it was a town parcel or a privately owned parcel. And then the third thing was we did a more qualitative evaluation of vulnerability to these critical facilities from all the other hazards that we've looked at. We really focused on the flooding in those first 2 categories assessments, because those are the data sets that we have the most sort of mappable data to use and to look at. So we focus on the flooding impacts the most. I mentioned the critical facilities earlier. This is the first time you've seen a map. This is a distribution of the critical facilities that the local planning team identified. And they range from, you can see here in the legend, administrative, the fire stations, libraries, there's medical and nursing home facilities, schools, water infrastructure, hazardous materials, things like that. So this is the distribution of those critical facilities. All right, so what did we do? We took those critical facilities, mapped them. You can see they're all listed here on the left. There's 108 of them, I think, 108. 105? Yeah, 105, thank you, Kelly. And so we're showing the categories, whether it's an administrative facility or a fire facility or hazmat, and we quantified whether those facilities were in a FEMA flood zone, and that's that third column, or are they in one of those Army Corps of Engineers slosh zones? Are they going to flood during one of those category storms? And if so, what's the lowest category storm it's going to flood under? And then the last three columns show future flooding probability for any of those critical facilities. I'm using that MCFRM data that I said Woods Hole Group developed, and it shows you the probability of flooding at each of these facilities in 2030, 2050, and 2070. So one thing that I think this is really useful for is sort of future planning. So for example, areas that aren't right now in, say, a flood zone, a FEMA flood zone. So for example, the Human Services Department. It's not in a FEMA flood zone right now. The Army Corps data shows that it would flood during a Category 3 storm. In future flooding, we're showing that it's got about a 4% chance of flooding in 2070. So that's a long way off. I get that, but it also just sort of should point to, if there's any sort of redevelopment at that site, if you're going to do anything there in the future, you might want to consider the fact that in 2070 you're going to have a slight risk of flooding there. So I think that's one of the valuable things that we see from these data. The other thing I think is just when these future flooding probabilities really start to get high, that's something we want to take a look at and work that into the planning process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm going to flip through all the other, just to show you all the other critical facilities. This table's pretty empty. You've got East Marine and Twin Marinas here. Woods Hole Community Center. One thing I wanted to point out back here, the drawbridge hut in Woods Hole, it shows a really high probability of flooding in the future. And that's one thing we need to go back in and sort of tweak, because we don't have the elevations of these structures in our critical facilities list. And so even though that, plan view, that drawbridge hut is within these flood zones, it may be elevated out of those flood zones because it's just a little bit higher. I do think that it's vulnerable though, because it's right there. But we're going to tweak this, probably fix these numbers a little bit based on elevation. So here you've got the community center of Woods Hole. You've got the Coast Guard station and Cape Cod Free Clinic and Community Health Center. Those are areas that are going to flood in the future. Island Queen, Steamship Authority. Those are both actually quite vulnerable in the future. The town pump out boat. I can't remember that. We got to look at that, Jen, because I'm not quite sure if that's where that boat is docked, or we'll take a look at that. Water Street Pump Station, and then a bunch of the pump stations are vulnerable. So that's another thing to look at. And I know that the town is sort of, through Amy, is looking at some of this with a grant, trying to reduce vulnerability of the town's wastewater system. So those are things that are being addressed currently. All right, we're almost at the end here, but there's this is the second way that we looked at vulnerability, and this is the town where we're looking at all the parcels in town. And I'm going to try to walk you through this table. I know it's confusing, but I'm going to try to walk you through it. So we use land use data, and it classified all the parcels in town according to the categories that you see on the left. So it's residential, single family, multifamily, temporary lodging, so on and so forth. These categories, I believe, align with categories that are in your land local comprehensive plan and other planning documents in town. So they should align. The plan should align in terms of those land use categories. And so we use them with those land use categories and looked at how many of those properties were vulnerable to flooding based on the FEMA V zone. So that's the most damaging flood zone that FEMA has. It's flooding during a 100-year storm that also has waves bigger than 3 feet. And so, for example, with this top category here, residential single family, we quantified how many parcels in the town of Falmouth are in a B zone. How many residential parcels, single family parcels are in a B zone. Well, it turns out to be 18,636. Actually, that's the total number of parcels in the town. The total that are in that B zone are 1,307, or 7% of the total number of single residential family parcels. And then we look at the value. So the value of the buildings on those lots, the total value in the B zone, and the percent of that value in that B zone. And then we also looked at the total value of just the property. So that's not only the building, but also the property. So we did this for the FEMA V zones, the FEMA A zones, FEMA VE and AE. We also did it for, I don't have all these here, but we also did it for the Army Corps of Engineers slosh model category storms 1, 2, 3, and 4. You can see here, this is for the parcels that are in slosh 2 category. And then we also did it using our future flood risk data and looked at storms where there was anywhere from a 1 to a 20% chance of inundation, say in 2050. We did the same thing for 2030 and 2070. And then storms with a probability of occurrence of 20% or greater inundation. So these data are really valuable in helping us target our mitigation actions that are coming up in Chapter 5, and we'll be working with the Planning Committee to help develop some of those recommendations. Public participation, I just wanted to touch a little bit on how the public can get involved in this process and what the opportunities are. So this meeting here is one opportunity for public input. There's a second meeting that'll happen in July. That's another opportunity. We'll have the draft hazard mitigation plan developed in July, and that will be posted on the town's website. And we'll be soliciting comments and feedback at that point. So those are the 3 big opportunities for public participation. I know that these meetings are also going to be posted on the FCTV, so in the event that people want to look at it on their own and provide comments, that's certainly something we encourage as well. If there are comments outside this forum here, they can send those comments to Jen, and Jen will work with Jen to get those comments answered. As I said, there's a second public presentation in July, and the draft plan will be open for review in July as well. As far as the schedule goes, this sort of shows the schedule we have for this. So we were contracted back in December of last year. We have, as of March, pretty much finished up chapters 2, 3, and 4. So that's the hazard review and the vulnerability assessment. We've given this public presentation today in March. We're going to work starting now and moving into June to develop those mitigation actions. We've got, I think, 3 more meetings with the local planning committee to help develop and review those actions. We've got this presentation here in July, early July, and we hope to be able to develop the final plan that we'll give to the town, and they'll submit to FEMA, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, and FEMA for approval sometime in late July. Based on the schedule here, we hope that the town would have approval of this by September of 2022. That's if all goes well, but I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. We've been pretty successful at Witzel Group with submitting these plans or working with the towns to submit them and getting just a few comments that are really pretty easy to address. So that time period between, say, July and September is expedited because we're getting good at this, and we know what they want to see, and we're including it in the plan to begin with. I think that's my last slide. Again, questions can be submitted to Jen. I'm certainly able to take questions here and now. Callie can help me address them. It's a sort of question for, just Falmouth residents about, just trying to pull information out of them about areas that they know that are vulnerable, or any areas with coastal erosion, and just trying to pull information out of the community's residents to, make that hazard area of the plan stronger. So I'm certainly open to answer questions if you'd like. Sure.
Pat Murphy, I'm with Falmouth Schools, and we've been involved in the program, and this is terrific, thank you. Focus on the mitigation phase of the work now. How are you sort of bringing in the issue of our utility infrastructure, meaning electric, natural gas, internet infrastructure in Falmouth, and what feels like, at least over the last half dozen years, that the power quality, those kinds of, our ability to count on our utilities feels like it's being degraded.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's accurate or not, I don't have any data, but schools across the region have lost more days because of power outages than snow on the roads. Or DPW, in a day or two, they'll get the snow cleared away. Power outages have been feeling like they're worse and worse across the region, and that's a mitigation strategy.
So is it power outages, would you say, due to sort of high winds? And I know that storm we had back in October.
There's a wind today in East Falmouth that somehow turned the power out for 30 minutes in East Falmouth. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yes, it tends to be winter. Your top vulnerability is winter storms or storms in general. It tends to be impact from storms.
Yeah. Well, I think that we would, I think we'll see some of those occurrences in the data when we start looking at it, and we're certainly working with town staff to formulate recommendations for how we can, protect that infrastructure and mitigate from future vulnerabilities. I don't know what those recommendations are yet. I can't tell you. We probably had some of those in the previous plan. I don't know if we've implemented them or not, but
I guess my question would be more specifically, are there, as part of the mitigation discussions, do you plan to have meetings with our utility providers to talk to them about their infrastructure, specifically in Falmouth? That would be the specific suggestion.
yeah.
I can't say that. I know Eversource has been ramping up their efforts in Falmouth. One interesting thing that we've found out, and Chief, you can back me up on that, is when we had the October storm, the windstorm, the power was out in Falmouth for days and days. There were generators running. We had trees coming down. We had some subcontractors coming in. And then when we had the major snowstorm in January, we didn't lose much power at all. I think all the trees came down in that October storm. What happens is a lot of it is the overhead cutting around the trees and the branches that the power companies have to be a little more aggressive on. And it's always a back and forth because abutters do not like they like the overhang and the canopy of the trees, so it's always a back and forth with the power companies. But I think in October it was a clear thing. You could see that the trees came down because of the power went down because of the trees. And then in January, when we had the snow and the wind, we did not have much power outage. Is that true, Chief?
Yeah, I agree. October was, I don't want to say it's an anomaly, but it was sustained high winds, and the amount of tree damage was widespread. So even though I have to, give a little bit of accolades to Eversource, they do mobilize their equipment based on the weather, and they do plan. It doesn't help the community when their power's out and they don't think it's getting taken care of, but they are mobilizing a lot of their equipment. But when the damage is as significant as it is, and when the storm is still underway, they won't be going up into the air to address the repairs. All they start to do is map out where they're going to start, and they work from like the power station to the substation on out, because they have to make sure that everything's starting to ramp up so that they can start getting the power done. But in reference to what Peter was saying, you know, they are doing more work to do tree limb and a vegetation clearance around their major transmission lines. And that's been underway, and they've been in town doing it because one of the critical infrastructures is the hospital. And the hospital was losing that power, and even though they have a pretty significant generator, they were out with for a little bit longer than they expected, and like everybody else, they have generator issues. So they, after one of the storms, they cleared all the way up to Churchill Drive. They were doing all those major lines that were up there. So I'm hopeful that they're starting to do that, but it's a thankless job for them. They you know, and I do see them coming into town, and we have better relations with them, better liaison activity, and we get more notification. But in the last few years, it just seems that the damage is really significant, and we, you know, when we're trying to manage it from our end, it's not happening fast enough. But because of, if a pole's involved, it's even worse. If a tree's involved, you know, you have to have tree companies, and not necessarily DPW may not be able to do it. So, you know, it's definitely something that, you know, I think it's of interest to pass along, and maybe we can, you know, have a
yeah, very specifically is
Yeah.
in the mitigation strategy, if we could have some sections related to, I guess, utility resiliency or something like that.
Yeah.
Because
That's a great
living on
idea.
Cape Cod is,
Yeah.
you sometimes feel like power is not a 100% certainty.
And I can certainly I can speak to them, and you know, and our representative might be able to help, maybe even come into a meeting or something like that. So
Thanks.
I think it's a great suggestion. So some things came to mind. So is there some, you know, as potential recommendations, you know, is there something that the town can do to encourage Eversource to continue the street clearing thing? I don't know if we talk about what that might be. Another might be, you know, the town could do some public education to these neighbors that don't want to allow the tree cutting. I happen to live in one of those, and my neighbors got the letters, and they're all like, oh, I don't want to do this. And I'm like, well, but yeah, but remember the storm. And so I think if there was some sort of education to the people that might encourage them to allow it, maybe some sort of contracts with tree clearing companies in advance. I don't know, maybe you already do that, but that's another thought that just came to mind. And then I'm just thinking of redundancy, like, do you have backup
We
generators?
have generators.
Okay, all right.
But to upgrade generators is extremely
Very
expensive.
costly, yeah.
If you're gonna upgrade to assume that you need to run schools
Yeah.
on a generator, it's, in every town building would be like that.
Sure,
right?
yeah. Yeah, but that's a really great idea, and we'll talk about it in the planning committee and see if we
Thank
can address have some mitigation actions to address those. Yeah. Any other questions?
I just have a couple of comments and a question, but one comment is that Bridge Tender's house down in Woods Hole.
Yeah,
So you got the tender's house at street level, and that's 10 feet above the water line, or it's up at the street level with the bridge. The motor room of that is the center line of the motors. If you look at the design plans, the center line of the motors on that is below the tide, below the water line. You have to walk down a stairwell to get down to the motor room. So when it was designed, the motor room was below the water level. So when we look at that, we want to make sure that we use the control motor room as
the elevation, critical
the
elevation.
governing, yeah, correct, and not the street level.
Yeah,
And we found that out in 2012 when it was Tropical Storm. Sandy came in. It flooded that whole basement out.
is it in a waterproof? Is it
It
not
was,
waterproof?
it was not. Since then, we did some mitigation on it and built a bulkhead around the back of it, and we did some other work inside, but it was not.
Yeah. All right, yeah, so we should connect on that and get those elevations and sort of factor that in here, and then.
It's the lower
maybe-
level,
Yeah.
yeah.
Leslie,
thanks.
those elevations were provided for the vulnerability
Vulnerability, yeah,
assessment.
yeah,
So all those
okay.
elevations, I know
Joe
the
has
town,
them.
the town survey crew went out and did a whole slew of elevations for a lease.
Okay,
And I know the Drought Bridge was one of them,
What location was that again?
That's the bridge tender's house at,
Water Street.
down on Water Street. The second comment is so you had showed on the slush maps that East Falmouth with Minot, and we're still waiting on the final permits to do the bridge and the nourishment on the
Yeah.
beach. So that should be a pretty good, because we're doing some, I would call them drastic changes to the areas over there with the nourishment and opening up the bridge to twice the width. So that should be interesting to see in the next plan. We should have this done in the next plan 5 years from now if we don't
Yeah.
think something's wrong. But it'd be interesting to see how that works.
yeah. for
But
sure.
one question that I had is, so this is our second plan. We did a plan 5 years ago.
Yes,
And some of the projects that we had in the last plan that were going to be completed, we did not complete because of town funding and the
Mhm.
competing sources. If we put a project in a plan and it does not get completed, can you just keep on taking those projects and pushing them forward? At some point in time, is FEMA going to look at these and say you have to start finishing some, if you list them, you have to start finishing some of these?
you can put them in again and keep pushing them forward. I think we'll need to give reasons why we didn't, why the town didn't carry them out. And, lack of funding is certainly a valid one. But yeah, you can. You don't get, like negative points or points taken away because you've not taken them, not done them. It's just intended to identify the ones that are sort of the most critical and to try to encourage the town and keep a list and something that you guys can keep working against.
But it doesn't take any funds away from the grant or anything to
No,
get
no,
this
no.
done?
I would almost think the opposite, that if we continue to show that we really want to get these done, those different mitigation plans that we have, and we haven't because of funding, then when we go for a hazard mitigation grant through FEMA and MEMA, we can pull the plan out and say, we continuously list this as something that's really important to the community, but we don't have the funds to do it internally, and,
Yeah.
might boost our chances anyways.
Yeah, that's a good thought, yeah. Yeah,
Hi, I'm Bobby from the Housing Authority, and I just had a question regarding the listing. It looks like we are identified as being in a hurricane zone, but we're not identified as being in a flood zone. And I have 2 properties that are right across the street from the harbor. So I just wanted to make sure that was correct, because I
Okay.
would think they were in a flood zone.
okay, so if you're not in a flood zone but in a slosh zone, the reason that is because that Army Corps of Engineers slosh zone modeling is considerably more conservative than FEMA's maps. So it is entirely possible that you're not in a current day 100-year flood zone that FEMA maps, but the Army Corps slosh model shows that you might be inundated during a Category 3 storm. That's entirely possible because it's way more conservative. I don't know if we have the other 2 properties but we should look at that. So you've got 2 right across.
115 Scranton and 211 Scranton are right across from the harbor.
115 and 111.
211.
211. All right, well, we'll take a look. So that might be something that we should add to the list. Yeah.
Thank you.
What happens, what's at those facilities?
They're 2 senior developments.
Oh, right, yeah,
Vulnerable
okay, yeah, yeah.
population.
I think they are on here, but we'll make sure they are if they're not.
Thank you. One's a multi-story and one is a single level.
Yeah, I mean, we go through this big list here.
What were the addresses again?
115 Scranton and 211 Scranton.
Okay, thank you.
I can't pick them out very quickly, so it'll probably be under,
We were number 2.
yeah. Yeah, so that's your Category 4 slosh zone, that's like a major hurricane in the Army Corps model. And so that makes sense, that you're not in a FEMA flood zone, but if there's a major Category 4 storm, they're gonna be showing that you're flooding.
We lost the roof off of one of the buildings in between both of those locations in a storm.
Yeah, remember that, yeah.
The Admiralty.
Yeah,
These are the ones right next to
Windfall.
Windfall.
Right.
Yeah, okay, all right, I think they're in here, but we'll double check and make sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, it looks good. Well, thank you all for coming and listening, and you know, hopefully there'll be more public participation in the next meeting and review of the draft plan. Yeah, thanks for hosting us, Chief.
Thank you very much, Liz.
You're welcome.
Thank you for all of that great
Peter and Jennifer, you know,
Yeah,
also thank you for,
absolutely, yeah.
you know, for all the participation. But, so, our next meeting is on the 28th of April. We don't have an agenda item
working on
as
it.
of yet, but
Okay.
just, we do have a future tabletop exercise coming up, which, you know, hopefully we're still working on, so it's preliminary, but our annual hosting of Mass Maritime students is currently in play, and they're going to be working on something for their senior project, so we're hopeful that we can get that, you know, out to everybody in the near future.
It might be that date. They might be on the.
On the April, yeah, you know, it's all based on their exam schedule, so, you know, so we have to work with them on that, but they've been doing a lot of work since the fall on that project, so we're pretty excited about that. But again, I thank everybody for coming today, and I appreciate the ongoing work with the Woods Hole Group and working in conjunction with the department heads. There's an awful lot of information out there. It's you know, we're learning it as we go along, because again, it's every 5 years that we've been doing this, but you know, we're getting a good hold on it, and I think that, as you can see, the town of Falmouth has a lot of vulnerable spots, but it also has a lot of good work being done by everybody to identify these areas so that we, you know, we can plan ahead. And when we're in this room working during a particular storm through the use of the Emergency Operations Center, we're able to, you know, address problems as they come along, and this helps to build up our understanding of, you know, where we need to, you know, put our resources when we do have these events. So the only good thing about storms is we have a little bit of knowledge knowing that they're coming, and we get good information, you know, through the forecasts. Other events like the earthquake, you know, that we kind of got bounced around with. I was in my house, and I didn't know it happened, and everybody else in my house was like, "What the hell was that?" And I was like, so maybe I'm just getting older. I figured it was just normal. Maybe just always doing this. So again, you know, so this is you know, very positive for all of us. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to come here today, and we'll see you in April. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, Steve.